The U.S.-Iran war is not Jeremiah 49 fulfilled. Here's why. Before we get into our topic, I would like to welcome you back to Rapture Insights, which is your premier channel for everything pertaining to the rapture and also eschatology, which is the study of the end times or the study of the last things. I'm your host, Pastor Marcus Brantley, and I'm glad you're tuning in. If you're not a subscriber, why don't you hit the subscribe button? And then also you can hit the like button, or if you want to wait until after you hear this episode, you can then like it at that point. So our topic today is the U.S.-Iran war is not Jeremiah 49 fulfilled. And here's why. If you bear with me, we'll walk through this and I'll give my explanation as to why it is not Jeremiah 49 fulfilled. Now, in recent days, we have been hearing about this war. Some would call it a conflict between Iran, the U.S., and Israel. And in the early days of the war, there were those prophecy experts, respectfully, that were given their opinions, and also students of prophecy were given their hypotheses, if you will, that this war is the fulfillment of Jeremiah 49, which speaks of the destruction of Iran, namely a judgment by God against the nation. And if you look at Ezekiel 38, that will signal to you that Iran, even though they're in this war, will ultimately not be destroyed. Why? That's because they are named as a formidable nation worthy enough for God to name them in Ezekiel 38 as being in confederate with the land of Magog that leads this invasion against Israel in the Battle of Armageddon, which will take place during Daniel's 70th week, also known as the tribulation period. So, regardless of the outcome and whether or not the U.S. and Israel bombs Iran, quote unquote, the kingdom come, it will not nevertheless destroy them because they have to engage in battle as per Ezekiel 38. They are an end times nation, and no one can change that. No prophecy expert, no student of prophecy, not even any global leader can change the fact that God's word has already gone out and it will not return to him void. So that's why I stand firm on the fact that Jeremiah 49 will not be fulfilled. My other reason why it will not be fulfilled is because it was already fulfilled in part. Now, let me explain why. Part of the prophecy has already come to pass. And there is a remaining portion of that prophecy that will take place, but that is after the tribulation period when Jesus returns and sits on the throne of David. And we're going to walk through this if you bear with me. Now, when it comes to prophecy, we know that some prophecies have a double reference. It can come to pass in the short term, and it can come to pass in the long term. Let me give you an example. When it came to Joel's prophecy about the latter days in which God will pour out his spirit upon all flesh, that spoke to the short term, which in that day was Pentecost, in which God did pour out his spirit according to the promise of the Comforter by Jesus Christ. We also know that in Joel's prophecy, it spoke of the sun being darkened and the moon turning to blood, the stars being shaken. That has not yet been fulfilled. That is future, and that will occur during the tribulation period. So that is an example of prophecy being fulfilled in part and coming to pass much later in part. Joel's prophecy being separated by almost 2,000 years, right? Pentecost being AD 33, And here we're in 2026, and the tribulation period has not yet occurred. So there's more than a 2,000-year gap, even though it was partially fulfilled. The same thing uh, is related to Jeremiah 49. So let's just quickly go through Jeremiah 49 so that we can see what the prophecy is for those that may not be familiar with it. And I hope you can read it on the screen. But it says, the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet against Elam in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah, saying. Now, it's important to note Elam, because Elam doesn't sound anything like Persia, neither does it sound like Iran. But we know that Elam was the capital city of Persia, which later became an empire, and then became, over the years, modern day Iran today. Now, Elam was a descendant of Shem. Shem had other sons, but Elam was one of his sons. And then Elam later settled in what we know today as Persia or Iran. And it was the capital city, named after that son of Shem. And typically in the Old Testament, God referred to nations by their capital city. And typically that capital city is named after the progenitor, the person who founded the city. So here, Elam is named just like you would Damascus being the capital of Syria. And Damascus is in the Old Testament as representative of the nation. Ephraim was the capital of the 10 northern tribes. And when the prophet referenced the northern tribes, the northern kingdom, it would be called Ephraim. So Elam is the capital of the Persian Empire. Now, it's important to note Elam because Elam's been around for a long time, thousands of years. And we also see Elam and I'm going to just divert because this is relevant and important, divert over to Genesis 14. And if that rings a bell to you, that deals with Abram trying to and successfully rescuing his nephew Lot from being taken captive by the Mesopotamian kings that went to war with the kings of Canaan. Now, you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? I'll get there. So if you read Genesis chapter 14, you see that the nation of Elam, led by this king, and I hope I'm not butchering the name, but it's Kedorlaomer. He was the head of Elam, and he joined forces with other kings. The title, the King of Nations, which nations in the Old Testament Hebrew is Goyim, which represents Gentiles. So those were probably nations on the western part of Persia, probably around Turkey, which was the Gentile nations, the descendants of Japheth. Then you also had the king of Babylon that joined forces with this king of Elam. And then there was another king it was 4 kings in total. And they joined forces and came against the kings of Canaan, Sodom and Gomorrah. I believe also the king of the Amalekites as well. And they were named the Amalekites actually before Amalek was born, right? Because Amalek was a descendant of Esau. But for the sake of identifying these nations, Moses, who wrote the Torah, namely also the book of Genesis, mentions them as the Amalekites. But it has a futuristic context, and I really don't have time to go into Genesis 14 to explain that. But just keep in mind that these nations are a type of battle of Armageddon, because the known world at that time was in Palestine, Persia, the Gentile nations westward over around Turkey, and then also Babylon. then also maybe south of Canaan, which was in Egypt. So in Ethiopia as well. So for this battle to take place, it was a type of battle of Armageddon. It was type of a global conflict in that region, which was pretty much the known world, with the exception of those southern kingdoms I just mentioned, Egypt and Ethiopia. But nevertheless, this was a type of global war, and Elam led it. Now, what was interesting in this war, that God gave Abram the victory where he was able to rescue his brother Lot. And I need to sort of accelerate this because I want to try to keep these videos under 20 minutes at least. So after Abram won the battle and rescued Lot, what was interesting is that a man of mystery came out of nowhere. I personally believe he came out of time and or came out of eternity, and his name was Melchizedek. And I believe that Melchizedek, and this is why I'm saying that Genesis 14 has a futuristic connotation, because there are some things that are named there that didn't exist at the time, but later came at a later time, a later point in time. But in any event, Melchizedek appeared and met with Abram, communed with him, gave him the Lord's Supper, which is future, the Lord's Supper, bread and wine. Abram gave him tithe. Again, future when you think of the Levitical priesthood. So here, what's important is that I believe Melchizedek was Jesus Christ, who will be on the throne of David, King of Salem, King of Jerusalem, that was not yet in existence. He's identified as being the King of Salem, but Jerusalem at that time was named Jebus, not Jerusalem. But yet Melchizedek was King of Salem, priest of the Most High God. Now, remember when Jesus in the Gospels was confronted by the Pharisees and scribes, and Jesus said that Abraham rejoiced seeing my day? I believe Jesus was referring to that moment in Genesis 14 when Melchizedek came and met, and Abram saw the future King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who was to come out of his loins. And that's why he rejoiced, because he saw that God's blessings would extend that far into the future, that he would give birth to a world leader, a righteous world leader, and also a high priest. Now, that's why Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. Well, we're not going to get into the theology of that, but just keep in mind that Abram, through Melchizedek, through God, overthrew Elam and these other confederate nations to set his nephew Lot free. Melchizedek is Jesus Christ, who is going to sit on the throne during the millennial kingdom. But first, Jesus Christ has to overthrow the nations that come against Israel in Canaan. Just like Genesis 14, Jesus will overthrow the nations of the Battle of Armageddon before he takes his seat on the throne of David. I hope you're making these connections here to Jeremiah 49, because now let's go back. It says, thus saith the Lord of hosts, behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the chief of their might. This is the judgment, and why people think that this U.S.-Iran war is the bow of Elam being broken by the United States. But what's interesting, it says, and upon Elam, in verse 36, will I bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven, and will scatter them toward all those winds, and there shall be no nation whither the outcasts of Elam shall not come. Keep that in mind, the four winds from the four quarters of heaven. For I will cause Elam to be dismayed before their enemies, and before them that seek their life, and I will bring evil upon them, even my fierce anger, saith the Lord, and I will send the sword after them till I have consumed them. Then it says, and I will set my throne in Elam. That has not been fulfilled. That's future. That is when Jesus is going to take the throne of David and rule over the world. But he's going to stop the nations in the Battle of Armageddon, which includes Elam, Persia, modern day Iran, that's in confederacy. And then it says, but it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring again the captivity of Elam, saith the Lord. So that's speaking of the future reign of Christ taking the throne and will be over all the world, including Elam. That has yet to be fulfilled and will be at the end of the tribulation period. Now, why do I believe that the major portion of this prophecy was fulfilled? Well, you have to go to Daniel chapter 8. Now, in Daniel chapter 8, that speaks of Daniel's vision. Let me pull that up for you quickly, if I can get my computer to act right. Daniel chapter 8. And you remember the vision he had? And that was between the ram and the he-goat? Well, it's right here. And we know by the prophecy that the ram, Daniel is told, the ram is with the two horns, Media and Persia. So if you go down to chapter 8, verse 20, it says, the ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. Because at that time, the Persian Empire was a twofold kingdom, represented by the two horns. And then in verse 21, it says, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Who is the first king? Alexander the Great. He was the head of the Greek Empire that conquered Persia. And out of his horn, if you go back up to chapter 8, out of his horn came four horns. Now, the ram, to back it up a little bit, the ram, which is Media and Persia, went to battle with the he-goat. And the he-goat ran, it says in verse 7, with choler, which is fury, anger. And he was running and his feet didn't touch the ground, which means he was running with a supernatural force, because God had already ordained what nations were to rise when he gave Nebuchadnezzar that dream of the statue. Babylon being the head of gold, Medes and the Persians being the arms and chests of silver, and then the belly and thighs of brass, which represented Greece. So Greece was the nation, the empire to rise, and it did, and is represented by the he-goat that came against the ram, defeated the ram, but with the one horn, and then that one horn became four notable ones. Key verse 8, it says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. Remember I told you about Jeremiah 49? Keep in mind the four winds, because out of that horn came four horns, which represented the four generals that succeeded Alexander the Great, and they divided the Greek Empire into four smaller kingdoms. And as a result of them conquering Elam, the Persian Empire was dispersed by the four winds amongst the four empires. This is why we know that Jeremiah 49 portion of the prophecy was fulfilled, and Daniel tells us it was in chapter 8. The portion of the throne of God being set in Elam is future, and that is when Jesus Christ sits on the throne, because he will rule the world, which includes Elam, all of the nations of the earth. So this war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran is not Jeremiah 49 fulfilled? Because it was already fulfilled by Daniel chapter 8, and it will be fulfilled the latter portion of the prophecy during the reign of Jesus Christ seated on the throne of David. So we're going to leave it right there. I hope that answers the question that the U.S. Iran war is not Jeremiah fulfilled, and here's why. Thank you for tuning in. I would like you, if you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button. Also, why don't you hit the like button if you found that this was beneficial to you and a blessing. Until next week, this is Pastor Marcus Brantley of Rapture Insights, your premier channel for things pertaining to the rapture. God bless you. Shalom, shalom.